Roberto Bolano is considered one of Latin America's most important writers, and today we're talking about one of his most popular books, The Savage Detectives. Welcome back to the Life on Books podcast. My name is Tony. With me, as always, is Andy, a.k.a. Metafictional Me Dead.
Morning, Tony.
You all right?
Yeah, it's a little bit frozen. It's been in the trunk of my car for a week.
Did you see that that meme I sent you? It was like what it feels like to crack open a Monster, and it was like the guitar solo.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Monster, please sponsor us. So today we're talking about The Savage Detectives, but as per usual, we will start with our weekly reading update. What have you been reading recently?
I don't know. What is time anymore? The holiday schedule has broken my brain.
Yeah. Funny you mentioned that because I said to my brother the other day that time is a flat circle, quoting True Detective, and he goes, all circles are flat. He goes, if it's not flat, then it's a sphere. And I was like, damn it.
I love your brother.
Well, he's an actual rocket scientist.
It's so on brand.
Yeah.
No, I mean, taking time off for Christmas and then going back to work and then having New Year's Day off and then going back to work has just like totally melted my perception of time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I don't remember if I had finished it the last time we spoke, but I finished Last Evenings on Earth, the Roberto Bolano short story collection.
Cool.
I read Nazi Literature in the Americas, a novel by Roberto Bolano. I've been chipping away at the Tunnel. I had fallen pretty far behind our unofficial group read while I was reading The Savage Detectives.
Yep.
And then I started to get a good head of steam going, kind of picking up the pace, feeling like I was going to get back caught up. And then the starting and stopping at work and every time I came back from like a day off or a holiday break or whatever, it was bonkers. So I've just not had the bandwidth to read that. I've read a little bit of The Savage Detectives Reread, whose author I cannot remember, but it's just, an analysis, kind of a critical reading of The Savage Detectives.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to read more of that before that discussion, but as I've mentioned, life has been getting in the way.
Mm-hmm.
I started The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, which you and I talked about. I've been enjoying, but I cannot make heads or tails of it.
Interesting. Okay.
It's I won't get into it because we'll do a further discussion in the future. But it's a ride. It's unique for sure.
Yep.
And then I was really, really focused on trying to stick with The Tunnel and The Last Samurai, so I could stick with the pacing of our group reads and not fall behind on anything.
Yeah.
But I got an Amazon gift card from a friend, and I used it to buy some books, one of which is 2120 George Wylesol. It's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure graphic novel.
Interesting.
Quasi-horror type thing. So basically the protagonist, is a computer repair man, and he shows up to this building to repair a computer. And he walks inside, and the door locks behind him, and it's this like a almost abandoned office building, and you're kind of exploring the office building. There's very bizarre things going on, and you're kind of exploring and.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it's very fun for sure. There are like puzzles that you kind of have to solve. Like a door will be locked, and you'll have to like kind of keep track. Like you'll find in a different hallway you went down, there was a printer that was malfunctioning and printed off this sheet of paper, and somewhere on that sheet of paper will be like the 3-digit code to unlock the door, and the pin or the code for the door will be like the next page number you jump to once you've unlocked and gotten into that locked room.
Very cool.
So you kind of have to. There's some parts I've been able to just like, oh wait, that was the thing. Other times, like I've been trying to like take some notes on it and stuff.
Yeah.
It's very unique. I should have brought it over because it's the artwork and layout of it is very cool.
Nice.
But it's very fun and very unique. So
the future of books, more interaction.
Yeah. I'm enjoying that, even with some of the like difficulty, I guess, of trying to like solve the puzzles and pay attention to what route through the building I've been following. It is kind of a different, or a nice break from something like, the tunnel.
Yeah.
It's difficult, but in much of a different way.
Yeah.
So,
cool. Is that it? Anything else?
That's
on
it.
top of those
That's it. No,
7 or 8 books?
That's it.
Cool. Much like you, I was trying to get caught up on The Tunnel for our unofficial group read of that. I just finished that yesterday. I wanted to finish it before the first of the year, but we had our last call about the Savage Detectives live chat for the book club, so I really needed to finish that.
Oh, I totally missed that.
Yeah, and then
Whoops.
it's all good. And then I had made a promise to myself that I wouldn't start any new books until the first of the year also. But then I was like, well, it's after the first of the year, but I still haven't finished The Tunnel, so let me just finish that first.
Yeah.
So last night I sat down and I started Butter by Asako Yuzuki, translated by Polly Barton. And I made it 7 pages and I put it back on the shelf.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just not feeling it, not for you, not the right time.
Maybe some combination of those things. Hard to tell. I want to be able to sit down and just feel like I'm not sure where this is going, or this is interesting, that's unique.
Yeah.
And it was more like, oh, I feel like I'm reading a little bit of a basic book.
Okay.
And so I just thought I'll come back to it. But if I'm already if I'm only 7 pages in and I'm already like, I don't really want to be doing this right now.
Yeah.
Let me just go grab something else.
Yeah. It is a weird mix because sometimes, especially not that this is a super long book, but I mean,
it's 420. That was the thing. I was like
450.
Ugh. Yeah.
Try to give it some time before I make a decision on what I want to do. But sometimes if you don't even get to the 10-page mark before you're like, well, what is that?
The writing just felt very, and this could be a translational issue because you never really know what translated works, but it felt very templated. I'm mentioning this detail now because that's what good writing is supposed to be, I was like, ugh, okay, let me come back to this when I'm maybe in a different mindset. So I went and grabbed Paranoia by Viktor Martinovich and translated by Diane Nemec Ignashev. And Viktor is a Belarusian author. And this was published in 2010, I believe, and was immediately banned in Belarus.
Nice.
Yeah. And this actually comes from Northwestern University Press. I want to hype them up for a minute. I have no affiliation with them whatsoever, but they have a completely insane catalog.
Dude, some of those university presses,
it's nuts.
Insane.
It's like hidden gems. Much like Open Letter, which is associated with the University of Rochester, I believe.
Yes.
But this was translated in, let me see here. I want to say 2018, but Jesus, I need to wear my reading glasses when I'm doing this podcast, I think. But anyway, I sat down with this and I'm already 70 pages in.
Nice.
Because it's very good.
Nice.
And it's kind of like a modern take on the same concept of 1984.
Okay.
But it's very much based in real life, what it's like to live in modern Belarus. And there's a lot of names of politicians and stuff in here. And so I Googled a couple of them to see if they were real people or not. And the first thing that popped up when I Googled it was a quote from the current president last week of Belarus saying, "We are not a dictatorship." And it's just so funny that it's like, bro, if you have to say that, not good.
Right.
not great.
Not great.
And so obviously not fun for the people who live there, but just kind of funny that this book was written 15 years ago now. And clearly this is still an issue.
Yeah. Wow.
But really enjoying it so far. So
cool. Yeah. Man, some of those university presses have awesome stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously you and I both love Open Letter, but, I was really impressed by just how many books Northwestern's published.
Yeah. Well, it was funny. I remember, I don't remember if it was on Instagram that I saw you post that, or I think it was in the Patreon like group chat where you were like, yeah, I just got a bunch of books from them. They have a crazy catalog, and I didn't get the chance to look into it yet, but I was kind of thinking like, oh yeah, some of those. A Naked Singularity, the University of Chicago Press.
Yeah. So I'm working on a video about college presses.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like, from what I've seen so far, that the University of Chicago actually is like the overseer of a lot of like smaller
cool.
presses. So they actually, I think, like possibly do the printing and like fulfill for a lot of smaller imprints.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So probably the way it works, just from what I've seen so far, is I think with like Chad was telling us when we had him on the podcast about Women in Translation Month, and he's the director of Open Letter for people that don't know. It sounds like as part of the university curriculum, these students are doing these translations, and then the college is publishing them. So what I'm assuming is happening with the University of Chicago is like a student somewhere in another college is probably doing this translational work, and then they're actually fulfilling on the printing side of it. Because I went and looked at a couple different websites, and when you went to go check their catalog, it actually backlinked to the University of Chicago.
Oh, really?
And then they had it listed like published on behalf of X, Y, and Z. And they actually had a couple books on there that looked like they weren't even college publications. So,
yeah.
But
I mean, that would make sense. I mean, Northwestern is in Illinois, right?
Yes,
I believe so.
Yeah. So, and they've been great. I've corresponded with some people there, and they've been awesome, super fast to get back to me. Because I actually reached out, because online, on Amazon, bookshop.org, and on like Goodreads and Storygraph, that book is listed as 528 pages.
Weird.
And so I messaged them, and I was like, I think this is wrong, because I just got this book in the mail, and it's only 280 or whatever. And she was like, oh, thanks for letting us know, because she's like, obviously, people don't buy books that big as frequently as shorter works.
Right.
So, but yeah. So that's my reading update, and hopefully we'll have a better start to the year moving past Butter. If you've read this, let me know if I should keep going or not. I was just a little underwhelmed, I guess. So let's talk about The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolano. If you've not read this book, it's loosely about a group of poets in Mexico and this poetry movement called the Visceral Realists, and
which is loosely based off of a poetry movement Bolaño was a part of.
Yes.
The Infrarealists.
Yes. And Bolaño, who since passed on, has said that this book was kind of a love letter to his friends or community generation.
Yeah.
So it kind of follows the travels and exploits of these poets, I guess, for lack of a better term. The structure of it is very unique. It's told in a 3-part structure. The first part is a series of diary entries. Part 2 is a series of depositions, interviews.
Yeah.
It's not really exactly clear what the situation is, but they're short stories effectively told by a wide range of people across a wide range of times and places. And then part 3 is a return to the diary entries of the protagonist from part 1. Okay. Give me your thoughts on The Savage Detectives.
I mean, I loved it. I know last time we spoke, you said that you had kind of fallen out with it.
Mm-hmm.
We're not enjoying the, especially part 2,
Mm-hmm.
the way it kind of splinters off, and how as part 2 gets going, like you kind of feel like you're going to be following the exploits of Ulysses and Arturo, the kind of 2 main poets of this visceral realist movement. or the Reformed movement. They are searching after a poet who kind of was the main figure of the original visceral realists.
Cesaria Tinahero?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the 1920s. And part two kind of seems like it's going to be kind of following their trail as they leave Mexico City at the end of part one. And then it does kind of splinter off and kind of follows their exploits after their trip to the Sonoran Desert, as they travel to Europe and different places in Latin America.
Yeah, they even go to Africa, right, at one point?
Yeah, Arturo goes to Africa, and they're in Tel Aviv, they're in Paris, Barcelona, other places in France and Spain. I know there's a Austrian character somewhere in there. I don't think they actually go to Austria, but kind of talk of all these different places and characters, and the further you get into it, seemingly less and less is happening, which I think is probably difficult for some readers. I really liked the way it was executed. It is funny, like sometimes, I think we were talking about this when you and I were at Gibson's last week, like sometimes there are books where nothing happens, and sometimes I love it, and sometimes I hate it.
Yeah.
I think it totally depends on the execution. And I thought this was executed brilliantly. I loved it. So that's kind of my initial thoughts. Let's hear what you have to say, because I know you were a little bit out. I'm hoping you came back a little bit, maybe not.
Well, let me preface this with, we did this as part of our book club.
Yep.
Shameless plug. If you want to join our book club, you can find the link down below. It's the best way to support the podcast. We had a very mixed bag of responses upon part one, just, the first initial impressions. So one of our most active and prominent members, I would say, is Rachel, who's a writer herself, and she's pretty well read a lot of great books, and her two favorite books are Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace and The Savage Detectives. I recently finished Infinite Jest, really, really liked it, and so I was very excited to
Shameless plug, we did a great episode on
Yes.
Infinite Jest.
There is an episode on Infinite Jest. So I was excited to read The Savage Detectives, and I was very surprised by how many people said they didn't like it when we first started reading it, because I loved part one. So what I really enjoyed about part one is I felt like Bolaño did a great job of making you feel what it's like to be a 17-year-old guy, boy, who thinks he's hot, who is a little bit on the artistic side, has this creative expression or desire for creative expression, kind of girl crazy. Just reminded me a lot of myself, to be honest. And I just thought it was so accurately written, and I loved the dialogue style. It just again was very, very similar to what it was like for me to be a teenager. And I don't know if I marked any examples of that, but there would be things like he would say something like, "Oh, I have an excellent memory, except for this, and this."
Right.
It's just like you're so full of shit.
Yeah.
And then it seemed like the book club, was pretty split on part two. So like when we got to part two, a lot of the people who didn't like part one were like, "Oh, now I'm getting into it." And then a couple people who liked part one were like, "Oh, I wasn't crazy about part two, but then it kind of won me over." Unfortunately, the book never won me over. So Reading this was like pulling teeth for me.
Wow.
I probably would have DNF'd it if it weren't for
The book club.
the book club.
Wow.
I think there's three main problems or three main reasons why that happened. First is I was concurrently reading The Tunnel by William Gass. And perhaps my impression of Bolaño's writing would be different if I could read it in Spanish. But it's tough to hold a candle to William Gass's writing.
That's fair.
It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. William Gass's writing is next level.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable. Line by line, it's like punches you in the face.
Yes.
So that was kind of tough for me. And also, I'm like you, I don't necessarily need like something to be happening, like there to be a strong plot narrative or anything like that. But Bolaño gives us 100 in this particular copy or edition, the Picador paperback, 140-ish pages is part one, where you really start to become invested in Juan Garcia Madero, who's the one doing the journal entries, Maria and Angelica Font, who he's kind of dating Maria-esque. Keem, their father, where everything's kind of happening around their household.
Yep. There's a lot of action.
But you just are like getting to know these characters. And then, I mean, Arturo and Ulysses are part of the story, but they're not really like that prominent in part one. And then part two is just this smattering of random ass people who have had some interactions with Arturo and Ulysses. So for me, it was like, okay, I don't necessarily know the people who are talking right now in part two. And they're also talking about kind of it varied story to story, but like sometimes a very like surface level interaction or relationship to these other two characters who I also really don't care that much about.
Yeah.
And the problem with coming back to part three is part two is so damn long that when I got back to part three, when you get back to Juan Garcia, I was just like, I don't care about this dude anymore. You know what I mean? Like I already kind of forgot.
Yeah.
And it's funny because a couple people messaged me on Instagram after they listened to the podcast where I mentioned I wasn't really loving it. And a couple people also said like, yeah, part two is just way too freaking long. I think if part two was maybe half the length, like if you'd cut out some of those testimonies that really just didn't do much for anything, I think it would have been a much different experience. Part three I enjoyed it more than part two. And there was a couple stories in part two that I was like, yeah, this is awesome. But a lot of it I just read and I was like, that was in one ear, out the other type of thing. Like it just didn't stick in my head because I couldn't care about it. So yeah, I'm really bummed that I didn't like it because I wanted to like it.
Right.
And I have another Roberto Bolano, two other Bolaño books. I have 2,666 on my shelf, as well as Nazi literature in the Americas. So I'll probably read Nazi literature, and then depending on that, I'll make a decision about 2666.
I'm curious for you to dig into Nazi literature because, like I said at the beginning, I recently read that, and I enjoyed it. Very conceptually, very interesting book. Narratively, there's not a ton that takes place.
Yeah.
As far as an overall narrative from cover to cover, it is imaginary biographies. So there are things that happen to the characters that are being biographed, but there's not like a main story from the first to the last.
Yeah.
Some references to like previous entries. I think I messaged you, I think it's, the blurb or whatever for the Savage Detectives, where someone said it's the novel Borges would have written.
Mm-hmm.
I think Nazi literature is much more of a Borgesian novel.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind, like, if there's no overarching narrative, like, I don't mind that at all, as long as the individual pieces are well written and are interesting, which I just didn't. There's this concept in writing and in film of show, not tell. And one of the easiest ways to conceptualize that is when you tell instead of show, it's kind of like just a list of facts, like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. That's kind of how I felt about part 2. It was very much like, oh, Arturo was in Paris and he met this woman and they had sex.
Yeah.
And then they were in Tel Aviv and they met these other people and they went to a store. It was like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, structurally, The Savage Detectives is not that dissimilar from something like Infinite Jest, where the book is broken down into these like smaller pieces. But I just felt like something like Infinite Jest does an infinitely better job of tying the whole thing together. And even if there's a particular part that you're not really sure how it plays a role in the larger story, that individual piece is just still so well written. You're like invested in that particular short story or blurb or whatever. So I've been kind of interested to read Nazi literature because I think that if you go into the book knowing that it is just like these short biographies or whatever of these people, I don't know. I just think it's a different experience, like depending on what your expectations are.
Yeah.
What is like the tone of Nazi literature? I mean, I would imagine it's very satirical.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's more up my alley.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, I mean, you get some like, some, like I wouldn't say background information, but some ideas of like these writers' political leanings and beliefs or associations, but there's not a ton of like, oh, this guy was writing, a Latin American Mein Kampf. Like it's
right.
It kind of seems like, they're writing, with the exception of some of them, it's just kind of like this guy is writing poetry. He just happens to be associated with some fascist political groups.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of ties into some of the bigger themes of Bolaño's work as a whole, of how like you have these writers and literary groups and things like that who are doing these literary activities while there's all these other atrocities going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of a question that comes up in like By Night in Chile, which takes place in Chile, obviously, kind of around the time of like Pinochet taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this dictatorial overthrow of the government, and Pinochet is installing himself into power. Like there's this literary group that's like meeting in a church basement and discussing literature on a very intellectual level.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but is it fair to be doing that while there's this atrocity going on in the streets above you?
Right.
Like, is that okay? Like, yes, is it important to discuss literature on a high level and have deep intellectual discussions about it? Probably. Like that's a net positive for most people.
Yeah.
But is this the right time and place to do it? Are we ignoring other bigger problems in the world to sit down and have this discussion?
Yeah.
I think on some level, like there's parts of that kind of makes me think about like you and I doing this podcast.
Yeah.
Like this is great for you and I. Like, we both get a lot of fulfillment and enjoyment out of sitting down together and talking about books and more of a long form discussion. Hopefully our listeners are getting some benefit out of listening to us ramble.
Yep.
But there's also a lot of bad things going on in the world.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to answer it, but you can ask the question, would we be better served in the grand scheme of things, taking the hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, out of our week that we dedicate to doing this and putting that time towards other more altruistic pursuits of, being more involved in like the bad things in the world. And I think that's kind of
being involved in combating them.
Yeah. Yes.
Just to clarify.
Yes. And I think that's kind of an underlying theme in all of his work is like, are we dedicating too much time and energy to the pursuit of literary endeavors?
Right.
Well, there's other bad things going on in the world, or
like taking it too seriously, basically.
Yeah. And I think for me, like, that's what I loved so much about the Savage Detectives. Like, you were just kind of talking about how in part 2, like, it becomes less and less about Bolaño, or excuse me, Ulysses and Arturo Bolano.
Yeah.
And how, like, they weren't necessarily the protagonists of part 1, but they were kind of a focal point of, you could say that Garcia Madero was the protagonist of part 1 and part 3, but his day-to-day, journal entries and things like that, would not be happening without the influence of these visceral realists. He very clearly like looks up to them and wants to be like them, and they've influenced a lot of the major life decisions he made.
Yeah.
At least at that point in his life. And as you get deeper and deeper into part 2, they become more and more background characters. And in some of the interviews, for lack of a better term, like they're almost mentioned in passing.
Right.
And I think that if it's, again, it's one of those things that if it's executed really well, I really like that, where you have these kind of, I wouldn't say protagonists, but they are major characters. Like, they are important to the themes and ideas and whatever narrative this novel has. But they're just kind of in the background, and their influence is a lot more subtle. And you get in part 1, I think we talked about this. I don't remember if it was on the show or in one of the live chats, but how, like, at the start of the novel, Garcia Madera is kind of on track to have a fruitful life. He's in law school. He's living with his uncle and aunt, who seem to be
pretty well off, yeah,
or at the very least able to financially support him.
Yeah.
They're not like struggling.
Yeah.
And he kind of just throws it all away to fart around with some bum poets.
Yeah.
And as you get it deeper and deeper into part 2, you get the perspectives of all the other characters that or most of the other characters that originated in part 1. And then you get some other characters that are new to the mix that encountered Ulysses and Arturo after they left Mexico. And you get the sense that these are all characters that in their youth were probably in a similar state of like really curious and excited about literature. And then they all kind of move on, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah.
It still might be a thing that's, excites them and interests them, but it becomes less of their whole life and more of, again, for lack of a better term, like a hobby.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, kind of like how you and I are doing things now. Like, we both have jobs and careers and responsibilities outside of reading and talking about literature. But
Trying to get rid of mine, but
right. We're still doing it. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
yeah.
Whereas Ulysses and Arturo like didn't really give it up as much.
Right.
Even if they've removed themselves from it a little bit, it's still a much more prominent aspect of their lives
Yeah.
than the other characters who, originated in part one. And I think, that's, again, kind of just ties back into everything I was just talking about. And something that I've read is kind of a theme of Bolaño's work is, I've said this before, it's kind of this like futility of literature about how they place it on such a high pedestal that they kind of ignore everything around them.
Yeah.
And I think you have to look back at what Bolaño was saying about how it's this love letter to his generation, about how, they were kids obsessed with poetry and literature. And, when you're a kid or at that age, like, and you have this obsession, like, it's very easy for you to be like, this is my future. I think about it when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, like I was obsessed with strength training. And like, that is what kind of got me into like, this is going to be my career. This is going to be my whole life. Like I remember when I was 19, 20, like just working the front desk at a commercial Globo gym, like
The dream.
right. And being bored and kind of sketching out like a layout of this gym that I was going to start. I was like, oh, I'm going to own my own gym when I'm 23, right out of college. And it's going to be awesome. And I'm going to have this. That didn't work out.
Yeah.
And it like part of that was, it was probably unrealistic in the first place, but I also like kind of came to some conclusions of like, maybe this isn't what I want to be doing.
Yeah.
And it started off as like, oh, maybe I don't want to own a gym. And then, in recent years, it was like, maybe I don't want to work in fitness for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
But I think you have characters kind of doing the same thing with literature where like it's their whole future. And then you have people that, again, lack of a better term, kind of wisen up and are like, this isn't going to be everything for me. Like it can be an important part of my life, but it's not going to be everything.
Yeah.
And then you have characters that don't. And they just kind of drift from place to place. And I think that's kind of the point of a lot of those more mundane
Yeah.
testimonials is like you kind of get both perspectives of like, okay, here's this person that did something that could be arguably more worthwhile than farting across Europe trying to write a novel or driving through the Sonoran Desert trying to find an obscure poet that's never actually published anything.
Yeah.
There
was definitely a lot in the book that was very charming to me. And I talked about this on the live chats about there's so many parallels between the poetry movement that they were in and my experience in the music community.
Yeah.
So when I was in high school, there was this band that a couple bands, local bands that me and my friends were obsessed with, and they were a little bit older than us, and the dynamic was very much like Juan Garcia Madero and Arturo and Ulysses is in the book, where like Juan Garcia is kind of around and like they know this kid exists, but they don't really like care about him at all.
Yeah.
And that's definitely how it was for us. Like we thought these guys were like gods. And they were just like, yeah, here's some kids that come to like every show we have, like whatever, you know. They barely gave us the time of day. But anytime they talked to us, we thought like, oh, we're best friends with these dudes, you know.
Right.
And then I obviously don't work in the music industry now, but my best friend, he continued on in bands and was in a couple bands that did coast to coast tours, a Canadian tour. They did some overseas stuff, which all sounds very impressive, but I don't think people realize like it's not all like tour buses. You're like living out of a van.
Right.
And you're like the money you're making at one show literally pays for your gas to get to the next one.
Right.
It's very shoestring. People love to over romanticize it. And so like Arturo and Ulysses kind of going all around on these travels reminded me of that, because a lot of times they didn't have any money. They were like trying to figure out where they were going to get their money from.
Right. They're just like working odd, like pretty much like what you just said. Like they're just working at this, camp in Barcelona to pay for their travel to Tel Aviv.
Right.
And I'm mixing up some characters and travels there, but like,
yeah, the general gist. Yeah.
They're trying to get from point A to point B, and the experience at point A is what's funding the trek to point B, and maybe influencing something they're doing on the literature side of things in between.
Yeah. And to your point about like never giving it up, some of those dudes in those bands that we loved when we were younger, some of those guys are like still in bands today. They're in their 40s, maybe even close to 50 years old. And I shot a music video for my buddy's band. He's in a band with some of these dudes now, actually. And it was like, they wanted to do it on a weeknight. And I was like, okay, fine. Like, what are you thinking? Like 5, 6 o'clock? Like, oh, no, we can't all be there till 9. And I was like, 9 o'clock on a, what are you guys talking about?
Right.
But that's just their life. Like, they have day jobs, but they're still like chasing that rock star dream. That
right.
Most weekend nights, they're playing gigs and they're out till midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. And I'm like, I don't know how the hell you guys do this anymore.
Yeah.
That was cool when I was 20, but I can't hang now. I'm too old for that.
So I could very easily understand why anyone would feel negatively about this particular novel, but
it just wasn't for me. I don't want to say like there was no point where I was reading it going, this is terrible writing, this is clunky or whatever. I just thought, I just don't like the style.
Right. Yes. Like I could see why it wouldn't resonate with some readers, but like for me, and I think it helps if you kind of, not that I did like a ton of research into Bolaño before we started, but I think at most I read like his Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
But kind of this, like I was saying, the idea of the futility of literature. I know we talked about it, or I brought it up when we did the Q&A, whenever that was, and someone asked about like favorite lines. I talked about the line in here where it's like literature isn't innocent. Mm-hmm. I think if you have those things in mind, what Bolaño is trying to do might resonate a little bit more.
Yeah.
Again, I could still see how like you have all of those things in mind, but then you're waiting for something a little bit more salacious to happen,
right?
Which never really
materializes. Well, part 3 had some.
Part 3 does, but you got to wade through a lot.
Well, I mean, this edition is 600 and some odd pages. Part 2 starts around the 140 page mark, and I think part 3 is very close to the 600 page mark. So there's like 350 pages roughly about.
Part 3 is not very long in any edition.
No. So what would you say overall, what is the point of the Savage Detectives? Like, even a very complex book like a Infinite Jest or a Gravity's Rainbow.
46 minutes.
46 minutes in here.
And you said it too.
Yeah.
It's normally me.
I mean, Infinite Jest is very much about addiction, overconsumption, kind of the fanaticism, the follies of over entertainment culture.
Yep.
Gravity's Rainbow is ostensibly about World War II, but obviously systems of control, government conspiracies, that kind of thing. What would you say the Savage Detectives is about? Or the point is, I guess.
I think at the simplest level, it's about the follies of romanticizing literature and being overly literary. And I think you could replace that with, you were just talking about how their following of the poetry movements going on was very similar to you following like local bands and things like that. Like, I think it could be, maybe not, literature could not, maybe not synonymous with everything, but a lot of like artistic type things or dumping your energy into a singular focus at a young age. I mean, you go back to what I was just talking about when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and was like obsessed with strength training, strength and conditioning, anything related to that. Like, there were probably things that I let fall by the wayside because I was hyper focused on what my training looked like, or work I was doing with clients or something like that, because it was my life and I loved it and I didn't care about anything else. So I think, again, it to me, it really ties back to what Bolaño said about it being like a love letter to his generation of these Mexicans that were born in the 1950s. There was a lot of political turmoil, not just in Mexico, but in Argentina, Chile, all these Latin American countries at that time. There was, rise and falls of dictatorships and different political movements, and that affects people culturally, and you see a lot of characters, again, kind of what I was talking about earlier, who are like there's a ruthless totalitarian regime taking over the country.
Yeah.
And they're all hanging out at some dude's house talking about obscure poets.
Right.
There might be bigger fish to fry.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, to me, it's again, just the kind of the follies of making something that's important for good reasons too prominent.
Yeah.
And just, you kind of see, again, like I was saying, like these characters, they kind of become background, and like everybody sort of knows them in some way or another, even if it's just in like passing. They're like, oh, I know that guy. Or like you come into, they encounter Arturo while he's working as this night watchman at a random camp somewhere in Spain.
Yeah.
And it's just like,
yeah, that story was ridiculous.
But again, like it just kind of shows like I think their presence is kind of felt throughout the novel.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, kind of showing that, like, where are they going with all this?
So out of the Bolaños that you've read now, because you've read, what, 4 or 5 of them? Savage Detectives.
5. Because I've read Antwerp by Night in Chile, Last Evenings on Earth, Nazi Literature, Savage Detectives.
What would you say is the top 3 so far?
Probably The Savage Detectives, Last Evenings on Earth, and Nazi Literature. I've talked about this a few times. Like when I first read By Night in Chile, I don't think I gave it as much attention as I should have. I think I was just kind of like, oh, it's a short book. I can read it, and I've got nothing to do this afternoon. Like, I can read this.
Yeah.
And it's also like told in a monologue with like no breaks. So it kind of was just like, oh, there's no clear stopping point. I'm just going to keep reading.
Yeah.
But I think, now that I have a better idea of what I think Bolaño is trying to get at across his whole body of work, and have maybe started to flesh out some of those ideas more, I would like to go back and reread that. And I think with that scope, it might move its way up the rankings of what I've read so far. But I think of what I've read, I would put it in that order.
So The Savage Detectives is about kind of tracking down these 2 Mexican poets. Nazi Literature in the Americas is and The Savage Detectives is told in a series of kind of short stories, for lack of a better term. Nazi Literature in the Americas is a book told in short biographies of writers, and 2,666, which I believe is how it's supposed to be said because it refers to the number of miles of length of that Chile is.
Yeah, and someone said that the original Spanish title translates more accurately to 2,666.
It's just a mouthful.
I'm going to keep calling it 2666 because it's just quicker and easier to say.
But that's about tracking down a German writer.
Yes.
Okay, and I have heard that structurally it's similar to the Savage Detectives. It's like journal entries or shorter stories. I don't know either.
Yeah.
I have to ask: do we think that Bolaño's a one-trick pony, like only writes it this one way or about this one topic? Because he kind of just writes about writers. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit biased because, like I was saying, I think the kind of some of the major themes of the Savage Detectives and some of the books that I've read from him, they all kind of have like similar themes, and I think it is there are themes and ideas that he kind of pursues across all of his fiction. So, I mean, if you are not a fan of Bolaño, like I think you could maybe make that argument.
Yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
A lot of writers and other artists and other mediums will kind of just do one thing very well.
Yeah. But I think, I've seen a few people talking about how in 2666, like this search for this German author, it's kind of a symbol of like the characters on their pursuit of knowledge. So
I've also heard a lot more violent.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of femicide that takes place.
Yikes.
Which, and again, I don't remember, obviously I haven't read it, but, characters trying to figure out like what's going on there kind of ties into this same thing of these characters searching after this author, of like this pursuit of knowledge and trying to figure out what's happening, what's going on. So I think there's a lot of similarities, but I also think it's more so Bolaño exploring similar ideas and themes and patterns and structures across the his body of work, than him being a hack and not being able to do anything else.
Right.
I think.
Well, I'm a zero trick pony, so I'm not hating.
And I know you're not like trying to disparage him.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at someone like Pynchon, like, yes, there's differences within the novels, narratively and things like that. But there are also these overarching themes of paranoia and systems of control and who controls the flow of information and things like that. Not many people are calling him a one-trick pony.
Right.
But I think,
so stylistically though, his books, I think, can be a lot different.
Yeah.
From what I've read and just from what I understand about some of them. But well, we can discuss that another day.
Yeah.
Next week, what are we doing next week? I think we'll do the our favorite indie publishers next week.
I don't know.
Just plan on maybe hearing about that. As always, if you want to join the book club, the link is below. It's $5 a month for the book club, or you can do our top tier, which is $7, which gets you some extra content as well. It's the best way to support this channel, which does not have any sponsors. So be part of this awesome community. It's actually great.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great discussion happening in there. A lot of awesome people, very nice people. So it's been a lot of fun. We do live chats once a week talking about the books that we're reading. We're currently reading The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, and my dog is barking, so it's time to go. See you next week.